Sometimes consistency doesn't matter. Okay, so abortion's in the news right now. I'm sure pretty much everyone who watches my channel probably knows this. There was this law in Texas that was enacted, and the Supreme Court declined to strike it down. They kicked it back down to run through all of the courts. And this law, bans abortion after 6 weeks. The state's not enforcing it. There's this enforcement mechanism where if you're a private citizen, you can sue someone if they're involved in procuring an abortion. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. At least I'm not going to be talking about whether that's a good or a bad law or the particularities of the law or whatever. I want to examine some of the rhetoric surrounding the abortion issue more generally. I think now is a good time to do that. A common objection against people who are in favor of abortion restrictions or who describe themselves as pro-life goes something like this. You aren't really pro-life, or the pro-life movement isn't really about protecting babies. If it were, or if you really were pro-life, if that was your goal, then you would support all these measures that actually help women who are giving birth or who are pregnant. That, universal health care, maternal leave, all these sorts of things that help women in these situations and help babies in these situations. You would support those things if you really cared about babies. The fact that you don't, the fact that pro-life people don't support those things, now let's just take a pause for a second, some do, but the fact that a lot of them don't, or those that don't, shows that they don't really care about babies, they don't really care about life, they really just are trying to control women in some way, because they're not trying to help them in their situations. And also, the burden tends to fall on women. Or at the very least, people who are pro-life aren't pursuing the goal of getting men on the hook as much as they seem to be pursuing the goal of making it difficult for women to procure abortions. Now, it's worth pointing out here, I think, that these sorts of ad hominem arguments can be flipped around on pro-choice people as well. Those who are pro-choice typically resist the label of being pro-abortion. They say, no, we're not for abortion. We're for choice. We think that women should have the freedom to choose, especially in situations that are difficult. Maybe the woman is raped, or maybe the financial situation is very difficult for them and they're not in a position to have a baby. Maybe they're like 14 or 15 years old. Maybe it's a case where the life of the mother is in danger, even though most pro-lifers agree that that's a case that should be an exception. Regardless, they typically say, I'm not pro-abortion, I'm pro-choice. A person on the pro-life side could say, well, if that were really true, if you really only cared about women's health care and you weren't pro-abortion, then you wouldn't be trying to advocate to have abortion accessible for any reason throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, including for reasons like, oh, my baby's going to have Down syndrome. Or, that really covers literally anything. Maybe you wanted a girl instead of a boy. That would be allowed under the current regime. There's no anti-discrimination laws when it comes to abortion. And there is no circumstantial limitation when it comes to abortion right now in America. You could have it for whatever reason. It could be for dire reasons, maybe for the case of rape or life of the mother, or maybe you think a difficult financial situation could be one of those cases, or it could be for complete convenience. You could be using it for basically for birth control. You could be using it as a sort of a backstop, so you can have consequence-free sex and not have to deal with that. All of that's covered under the law. If you really just cared about those difficult situations, giving women space to navigate difficult healthcare decisions like they often talk about, you'd only allow abortion for those cases. So you could easily flip around this consistency charge, this hypocrisy charge, onto the other side. And you could lodge it, I think, to both sides. There probably are people in both camps who have bad motives and who certainly are hypocrites and who are inconsistent in working out their ideology. Now, that's not to say that there's no way to believe in abortion restrictions and not believe in things like welfare. And it's also not to say that if you're pro-choice, you think it's fine to kill babies. You might just think that it's not a baby early on, or at least isn't morally equivalent to a baby. There are ways out of it, but there are also ways to lodge these hypocrisy charges. But I'm here to tell you today that in this case, whether someone is inconsistent, whether someone's a hypocrite, doesn't matter. At least, let me clarify, doesn't matter with respect to the justification of the law. Even if your motives for a certain law are terrible, even if, let's say, people who are trying to enact abortion restrictions want to bring about the Handmaid's Tale, that wouldn't tell us whether or not the abortion restrictions are justified. Whether they're justified depends on whether the fetus has a right to life and whether that right to life outweighs bodily autonomy. That settles it. If that's the case, the laws are just. Period. even if those who are putting the laws in place have terrible motives, even if they're inconsistent in the way they carry out their cause. And that goes for the pro-choice side as well. Even if they are full-on pro-abortion, they consider the fetus a baby and they don't care how often and for what reason it's killed. Whether or not abortion access is moral or not, or rather is justified or not, doesn't depend on what their intentions are in enacting those or in bringing about those freedoms. It just depends on whether the fetus has a right to life and whether the mom's or the mother's bodily autonomy outweighs that right to life. If the fetus doesn't have a right to life, abortion access makes sense. If the mother's right to bodily autonomy outweighs that right to life, then abortion access makes sense, regardless of the motives of the pro-choice person or legislator. It just doesn't matter whether one's inconsistent or not when it comes to the justification of the law. That's not to say that intentions don't matter for any reason. I think they matter for a lot of reasons. They matter pragmatically, if you want to be convincing, if you want people to see your cause as just. They matter morally, if you want to have a coherent ethical response to a problem. There's a lot of reasons why they matter, but it doesn't matter to the justification of the law. So this is one of those cases where inconsistency is irrelevant. And in a way, drawing attention to motives is a complete distraction when it comes to debating the merits or demerits of a given law. I don't even think the intentions behind a lot of the people who were drafting civil rights legislation were always good. They were probably often just political. They probably often felt like their hand was forced by public opinion to sign legislation. And maybe their motives weren't pure. It doesn't actually matter. The laws themselves were just. All right, now that I've ostensibly undermined the whole point of my channel by saying consistency doesn't matter, let me reiterate. What I'm saying is hypocrisy and bad motives and inconsistent application of one's ideals is irrelevant to the justification of certain laws. Even if the laws are terribly motivated, even if those who enact those laws are completely inconsistent in the values that underwrite them, that doesn't tell us whether or not the law is justified or not. It's irrelevant to that question. It's relevant for a whole lot of other reasons, but it is not relevant to that question. And I think we really should set aside these kinds of what amount to really ad hominem arguments. Like, you're a bad person, so the law is no good. Or you're a bad person, so your law is no good. This is not clear thinking, and we should set this aside for more substantive debates about whether these laws are good ideas. And then we can have the conversation about whether those who are enacting these laws are good and what people should be doing alongside the restrictions or the permissions to have a coherent ethical response to a given problem. Okay, that's it for this video, and I'm sure it's not the last time we'll be talking about Texas or abortion. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next video.